Hello. The topic of today's lecture is the article by Derek Parfitt called The Unimportance of Identity. In this course, we've run into a lot of difficulties with identity. We've run into seemingly one dead end after another when examining one particular theory or another. But one thing has been consistent through our discussion, and that has been the assumption that identity and survival really amount to the same thing. That is, if there's something tomorrow that is you, well, then you survived until tomorrow. If there is nothing tomorrow that is you, you do not survive till tomorrow, and vice versa. If you survive till tomorrow, then there must be something that is you. This is a theme that's been carried through the majority of our readings. If you look at the dialogue on identity and immortality by John Perry. Perry himself is committed to this idea and discusses survival and identity as if they're interchangeable. When we talk about beaming in Hanley's article, Hanley himself uses the term survival when he really means to talk about identity. Again, he considers the two things to be completely interchangeable. Same with Penelhume, who talks about life after death, and in a sense uses the term survive for is identical with. And so yeah, this is a very common assumption, and it seems to be a good assumption. I mean, how could it not be the case that identity and survival go together? Well, Derek Parfitt is going to try and give an account of why that's in fact not so. Derek Parfitt himself is a British philosopher. He spent pretty much his entire academic career at Oxford. He wrote a couple of very famous books, one of which, the more recent of which, is called On What Matters, and then wrote a book called Reasons and Persons, which is also very good, covers a large number of very important topics. And his contributions to personal identity are noteworthy, sort of famous. And so he's going to give us an argument for identity and survival not necessarily being the same thing. And so if we start off where the article begins, one of the first things he does is make a kind of distinction that, again, we've made several times throughout the course, though in terms that have not yet been utilized. So this distinction is as follows. It's the distinction between talking about things that are qualitatively identical and numerically identical. Something is qualitatively identical when two things share a set of properties, that is, they are exactly similar to each other. The example that Parfitt gives are of two billiard balls. You see, they might have all of the same observable properties, but of course there's two of them, right? So they're only qualitatively identical. They're not the numerically identical is the identical that we're really interested in metaphysics. This is the sense in which Perry used the term, talked about the term identical twins. Identical twins are qualitatively identical. They're not identical, again, in the sense that we're interested in metaphysics. And in class, of course, this is the issue of the two markers. How can you tell that they're not the same? Well, there's two of them. Okay, so numerical identity is the kind of identity that we're really concerned with. This is the kind of identity where something is the same, is like literally the same thing as something. So one way to put that is when two ways of referring to something really refer to one and the same thing. Okay, and so he talked about the red billiard ball before and after it was painted red. Right after it was painted red, it has different properties than before, but it's the same ball that it used to be. Okay, he uses the example also Boris Nikolaevich and Yeltsin. Of course, if you don't remember Boris Yeltsin, because you perhaps weren't alive when that guy was alive, look it up, right? But a more familiar example perhaps is Bruce Wayne and Batman, right? We want to say Bruce Wayne is Batman, okay? The two are numerically identical. That is, there's really actually only one person. There are not two persons, Bruce Wayne and Batman. Okay. So numerical identity is the kind of identity that we actually care about in metaphysics. And Parfitt is going to be talking about this concept of identity that we've been discussing the whole unit. Parfitt here, this is just a quote from the text, says, "Most of us believe that we should care about our future because it will be our future. I believe that what matters is not identity, but certain other relations. To help us to decide between these views, we should consider cases where identity and those relations do not coincide. Which these cases are depends on which criterion of identity we accept." Right? That's familiar enough. What identity is depends on what your actual theory of identity is. And so he's going to start us off with a particular thought experiment that we're going to call the twin brother case. He doesn't really give it a name in the article, but let's call it the twin brother case. And he says as follows. He says, suppose that because of damage to my spine, I have become partly paralyzed. I have a brother who is dying of a brain disease. With the aid of new techniques, when my brother's brain ceases to function, my head could be grafted onto the rest of my brother's body. Since we are identical twins, remember that's identical in the sense of qualitatively identical, not numerical, my brain would then control a body that is just like mine, except that it would not be paralyzed. Should I accept this operation? Now let's think along with him for a second. What reasons are there for accepting the operation? Right? Well, the main reason seems to be that there will be an entity, right? Something will exist after this operation that will live a life just like the one that Derek would have lived had somebody cured his paralysis. And so if you just ask, all things being equal, if you could live a life just as if somebody had cured your paralysis, would you choose to do so? And it seems clear that the answer might be yes. On the other hand, somebody might argue that is like, well, look, if the bodily theory of identity is correct, then what's going on here is that you don't actually survive this operation. Rather, your twin brother gets to have your head, right? Your twin brother is who survives this operation, and he'll live the rest of his life with the delusion that he is you, right? And in that sense, maybe you don't want to accept this particular kind of an operation. But I think we can see sort of two things going on here then. The outcome of the twin brother case is that, number one, Derek survives if by survival one means correct anticipation and correct memory. Recall that this is the exact same criteria of survival that Gretchen used in John Perry's dialogue on identity and immortality. And so it's the very same definition of survival. It's correct anticipation, correct memory. That is, imagine that Derek buys a ticket to see Springsteen or something, right? Before this operation. Can he look forward to, after the operation, going to see Springsteen? And it seems correct to say that he can. Not only can he look forward to going to see Springsteen, he can look forward to walking there if he so chooses, whereas, while he's paralyzed, of course, he can't do that. And while he's at the Springsteen show, you might say, does he remember buying the ticket to go to see the show? And again, the correct answer seems to be pretty obviously yes. Okay, so if those are our criteria for survival, then Derek survives. But of course, the result of this operation isn't Derek, but instead it's Derek's twin if our criterion for identity is bodily continuity. Because of course, the body here is continuous with Derek's twin brother, not with Derek. Okay, so this example is supposed to show that identity and survival do come apart. This is supposed to be Parfitt's first example of where identity and survival are not going to be the same thing. Now, of course, the most natural response to this case is as follows, right? You might say, instead you say, hey, look, Derek, you're cheating here. Okay, this is not a case in which identity and survival come apart. It's a case that shows that the bodily criterion is false. Right? Note that this is just a version of the replacement argument. What we're doing is we're replacing Derek's body, right, with an exactly similar body, and then showing that it doesn't really have any effect on his identity, right? And so again, if you haven't seen it any number of times before, this is yet one more case where there is the replacement argument whenever we bring up bodily identity. So each of the last several times I've told you to mark this argument, you're going to see it again. Well, this time, this is the last time you'll see it. This is the last occurrence of the replacement argument here in the course readings. But of course, Parfitt has a plausible reply to us. He says, look, since there are people who accept the bodily criterion, okay, I am not cheating. There are people who really do believe that that's the correct theory of identity, and for those people, I have to be able to show them that identity is not what matters. Then he continues, he says, but I accept part of this objection. I agree that we should reject the bodily criterion. Right? And so from here on, he assumes that some form of psychological criterion of identity is the correct one. That is, this is the view that says that what we are our thoughts and memories, etc. So what follows here is a fairly lengthy quote from the text, so I'm going to go ahead and quote it in its full. Parfitt continues and says, "I am now assuming that we accept the brain-based psychological criterion. We believe that if there will be one future person who will have enough of my brain to be psychologically continuous with me, that person would be me. On this view, there is another way to argue that identity is not what matters. We can first note that just as I could survive with less than my whole body, I could survive with less than my whole brain. People have survived and with little psychological change, even when through a stroke or injury they have lost the use of half of their brain." This is actually true, medically speaking. You can look at all kinds of funny examples of this one. You can find them all over the place. Parfitt continues, "Let us next suppose that the two halves of my brain could each fully support ordinary psychological functioning. That may in fact be true of certain people. If it is not, we can suppose that through some technological advance it has been made true of me. Since our aim is to test our beliefs about what matters, there is no harm in making such assumptions." And again, he's correct. This is a thought experiment. You tailor it however you want it. The point is just to say, in a given sort of situation, what do we really want to say about identity? Okay. What Parfitt's doing is setting up what he calls the single case. And the single case goes as follows. He says, after half of my brain is destroyed, again, never mind how, the other half would be successfully transplanted into the empty skull of a body that is just like mine. All right, so let's think about what happens in such a case. And first, let's think about survival. Remember, the criteria of survival are correct anticipation and correct memory. So again, let's use the same example we used before. If Derek buys tickets to see Springsteen prior to this operation and the accident which makes it necessary, can he look forward correctly to seeing Springsteen after the operation? And it seems clear the answer is yes. Again, given that half of a brain is enough, it's sufficient to carry on ordinary psychological functioning. And so then we ask, while he's at the show, can he remember buying the tickets? And again, it seems clearly that the answer is yes. So because we can establish that correct anticipation and correct memory in this case, we can say, all right, he would survive the single case. Right now, we must look for identity. Okay, so Derek survives, but is the result of this operation identical with Derek? That is, numerically identical with him. Well, if our criteria of identity is psychological, then what we're looking for is to answer the question of whether the result of this operation is psychologically continuous with Derek. That is, does it have the same, beliefs, desires, etc., that Derek had, or do those things get preserved by the operation? And again, it seems clear that the answer is yes. We, just stipulated that half of a brain is enough to carry on ordinary psychological functioning, and we have no reason to believe that this case wouldn't happen this way. So the result of the operation is numerically identical with Derek. Again, as long as your criterion of identity is psychological continuity. Remember, he's got sort of a new body in this case, but we dispensed already with the bodily theory of identity. And so remember, Parfitt's trying to give us instances where identity and survival do come apart. And the single case doesn't do that. So the single case shows us where identity, and at least psychological identity, coincide perfectly well. But it's an intermediate case. And I think if you're thinking very carefully, right, if you've been very alert in terms of reading this and in terms of thinking this, by the time you get to the end of the single case, or perhaps even before you get to the end, you should have noticed something interesting. Why bother to say half of the brain? Why not the whole thing, right? And if you're thinking, well, because there are two halves, and because we're talking about psychological identity, something like the duplication argument is coming, well, you can give yourself a pat on the back, because that's exactly what's going to be happening. And this is what Derek calls the double case, right? So Parfitt continues here. He says, consider next the double case, or my division. Both halves of my brain would be successfully transplanted into different bodies that are just like mine. Two people would wake up, each of whom has half my brain and is, both physically and psychologically, just like me. Since these would be two different people, it cannot be true that each of them is me. That would be a contradiction. All right, so see what Parfitt has done here. He's taken the single case, which, to check our intuitions about the case itself, and then has, basically doubled it. And so now we have, in some sense, the duplication argument, which is a well-known problem for any psychological theory of identity. But let's really take a look at what happens to survival and identity in the double case. First, let's see if Derek survives. And again, we're going to use the example of survival that we've used a couple of times already, this example of correct anticipation and correct memory. Imagine that Parfitt decides to go on a ski trip after buying some tickets to see Springsteen. Right? So he buys his Springsteen tickets, he goes on the skiing trip, and gets into this terrible skiing accident where he skis into something really skinny, and it just sort of splits him right in half, and they can't really save the body, but they can save each half of the brain. They can't really put it back together, but they can put each half of into a different sort of new, exactly similar body, and so now there's two of them. But he's still got this Springsteen ticket, and so the question is, can he look forward to seeing Springsteen correctly? And remember what we said in the single case, that the result of that case, he can correctly anticipate having its experiences. In this case, though, he can also correctly anticipate losing out on the chance to see Springsteen because, of course, he only bought one ticket on the assumption that there would be just him in the future after his skiing trip. But in this case, he can correctly anticipate using the ticket to go see Springsteen, and can also correctly anticipate losing the coin toss and not being able to go and see Springsteen. Now, of course, it would have to be a coin toss because one might imagine that these two are going to have to find some fair way to decide who gets the Springsteen ticket and who stays home. And rock, paper, scissors isn't going to do it because, of course, if you're playing against somebody who has the same psychology as you do, it's going to be tie after tie after tie after tie. Nothing's going to happen. And so instead, a coin toss or something like that will work. My recommendation actually would be to go to random.org and flip a virtual coin because, of course, a virtual coin doesn't have any subtle physical biases like physical coins can. And also, random.org is better than sort of your standard coin flipping app that you might download on your phone because it will deliver true randomness and not mere pseudo randomness. And again, if you're really curious about the difference between those two, there's a really nice couple of essays about that at random.org, which is one of my very favorite websites to visit for a variety of reasons. And so in any case, Derek can correctly anticipate seeing Springsteen, and he can also, while he's seeing Springsteen, correctly remember buying the ticket. And in fact, the one who's not at the show can also correctly remember buying the ticket. And so we have this interesting double case of survival here, right? It's perhaps not just the case that Derek survives. He almost, you might say, super survives. There's more than one particular perspective that he can correctly look forward to, and each of these perspectives can correctly remember doing all of the things that he did. Because the source of all of that psychological continuity is the fact of that brain that is, of course, now split into two halves. But of course, the result of that operation is not identical with Derek. And again, remember, we've been using this psychological theory of identity, right? This psychological criterion. And according to that criterion here, we've duplicated, right? So it's yet another example of the duplication argument. We've known for a long time that the duplication argument will come up every time you start talking about something that resembles psychological identity. And again, each of the times before now, I've told you, look, mark that, you'll see it again. But here is the last one. This is the last instance of the duplication argument you'll see. But of course, its implication is very clear. They cannot both be Derek because there are two of them. Right? They cannot be the same person because, again, there are two of them. That would be a contradiction if they were the same person. And of course, Parfitt cannot be one of them rather than the other because he bears exactly the same relation to both of them. One of them has exactly as much psychological continuity with him as does the other. And so it seems pretty clear in this case that identity and survival are coming apart. And this can be a tough one to wrap your mind around, and so Parfitt gives us a little extra help. He explains here why identity itself isn't really the idea that matters. And again, this is a quote from the text. He says, "We may object that if that person isn't me, something is missing. I'm missing. That may seem to make all the difference. How can everything still be there if I'm not there? Everything is still there. The fact that I'm not there is not a real absence. It can be hard to believe that identity is not what matters, but that is easier to accept when we see why, in this example, it's true." So Parfitt is going to give us an example that he thinks is going to clarify why he thinks that identity itself is not particularly important, while survival tends to be much more important to us. And here is Parfitt's example. He says, imagine a community of persons who are like us, but with two exceptions. First, because of facts about their reproductive system, each couple has only 2 children who are always twins. Second, because of special features of their psychology, it is of great importance for the development of each child that it should not, through the death of its sibling, become an only child. Such children suffer psychological damage. It is thus believed in this community that it matters greatly that each child should have a twin. Now suppose that because of some biological change, some of the children in this community start to be born as triplets. Should their parents think this a disaster because these children don't have twins? All right? Now think about that for a second. Right? Imagine you're a member of this community. Imagine everybody has a twin. It might be the case that if you, through some accident, happen not to have a twin, you would miss out on a very, very common set of experiences, right? You would sort of have, there was something be different about you than everybody else, and that could be tough. It could be a tough thing to live through if sort of everybody was, a certain way. But now imagine instead of having no siblings, you had 2 siblings, right, that were also exactly your age, right? It seems like you haven't really missed out on any of the things that ordinary twins miss out on, or that ordinary twins have. Instead, it seems like whatever ordinary twins have, you also have +1, right? And so it seems like that the parents of such a child should not regard it as a disaster that their child is not born a twin. So Parfitt continues. He says, clearly not. These children don't have twins only because they each have 2 siblings. Since each child has 2 siblings, the trio must be called not twins, but triplets. But none of them will suffer damage as an only child. These people should revise their view. What matters isn't having a twin, it is having at least 1 sibling. Right, so he points out here that the reason that they can't be called twins is pretty trivial. It's because there are 3 of them, they have to be called triplets instead. The thing that seems to really matter is whether or not the child has a sibling in this kind of a community or not. And so I think the parallel should be reasonably clear. He continues, in the same way, we should revise our view about identity over time. What matters isn't that there will be someone alive who will be me. It is rather that there will be at least 1 living person who will be psychologically continuous with me as I am now, and/or who has enough of my brain. When there will be only 1 such person, he can be described as me, and when there are 2 such people, we cannot claim that each will be me. But that is as trivial as the fact that if I had 2 identical siblings, they would not be called my twins. Right? So this is an example that I think will help to get across his idea that it is not precisely identity that matters in a case like the double case. He says, sure, there will be nobody in the future who is me, but the only reason for that is that there are 2 such people. Right? And so it will be very clear that I survive, that there will be people who, more than 1, in fact, who are psychologically continuous with me. I will continue to lead a life just like one that I would have led. It's just that there's someone else who also is living a life that could be just like one that I would have led as well. And the fact that neither of them is me is just as trivial as the fact that if you don't have, if you have two identical siblings, qualitatively identical, then we have to call them triplets. Instead of if you just have one, then you can call it a twin, right? And so he says, yes, you can call this thing me, or you can, not call it me because there's two of them, but that just doesn't matter very much. It's a very interesting example. And he concludes the argument, concludes the article in this case, with a rather poignant sort of phrasing here. He says, even the use of the word I can lead us astray. Consider the fact that in a few years, I shall be dead. This fact can seem depressing, but the reality is only this. After a certain time, none of the thoughts and experiences that occur will be directly causally related to this brain or connected in certain ways to these present experiences. That is all that this fact involves. And in that redescription, my death seems to disappear.